Hello there, my sleepy hearts. Tonight, we step into a mind that has never known silence, a consciousness drowning in the thoughts of everyone around him. For over a century, Edward Cullen has heard the world think, has listened to the endless chorus of human and vampire minds broadcasting their secrets, fears, desires, and lies. His gift is telepathy, and it is both extraordinary and unbearable. So, before you settle in, please support us and subscribe to the channel so we can keep creating these Twilight stories. Well, now it's time. Get yourself settled in. Close your eyes. Breathe in very slow. And drift into the peculiar solitude of knowing too much, where every mind is an open book, and silence exists only in one impossible place. The gift manifests as voices, constant and unavoidable, speaking directly into Edward's consciousness without pause or permission. He does not read minds in the way humans imagine it, scanning thoughts deliberately or choosing when to listen. The ability is always active, always receiving, a radio that cannot be switched off. From the moment he woke as a vampire in 1918, he has heard the thoughts of everyone within his range, their mental voices as clear as if they were speaking aloud. Over 100 years later, the broadcast continues without interruption, without rest, without a single moment of the silence that humans take for granted. The range extends for several miles in optimal conditions, though distance affects clarity significantly. Nearby thoughts come through sharp and detailed, complete sentences and clear concepts flowing directly into his awareness. A person standing across a room broadcasts their thoughts as loudly as their spoken words, perhaps more so because thoughts contain the unfiltered truth beneath social performance. As distance increases, the clarity diminishes. Thoughts from a mile away arrive as whispers or impressions rather than complete ideas, like catching fragments of conversation from another room. At the outer edges of his range, perhaps 3 or 4 miles depending on terrain and interference, he perceives only the general presence of minds, a sense that consciousness exists in a particular direction without being able to discern specific content. What he hears is not perfectly formed sentences or organized narrative. Human thoughts are chaotic, fragmented, jumping between topics without logical transition. A person might be thinking about their grocery list, then suddenly remembering an embarrassing moment from childhood, then wondering if they left the stove on, all within the span of seconds. Edward hears this stream of consciousness exactly as it occurs, unfiltered and unorganized. Some people think in words, constructing internal monologues that sound almost like speech. Others think in images, emotions, or abstract concepts that translate imperfectly into language. He perceives all of it, his vampire mind processing and interpreting the various forms that human consciousness takes. Vampire minds differ from human minds in ways that match their enhanced cognitive abilities. Vampire thoughts move faster, process more complex ideas simultaneously, maintain clearer focus when concentrating. Where a human mind might hold one or two active thoughts at a time with others lurking in the background, a vampire mind often juggles multiple streams of thought at once without confusion. Carlyle, for instance, might be conducting surgery while simultaneously planning family logistics, reflecting on a philosophical question, and monitoring his thirst, all four thought streams running parallel and clear. This complexity makes vampire minds more interesting to read, but also more demanding to process. Each vampire in Edward's range provides significantly more mental input than any human. The constant mental noise is the most challenging aspect of his gift. Imagine standing in a crowded restaurant where hundreds of conversations occur simultaneously, all at equal volume, all demanding your attention. Now imagine that you can never leave that restaurant, that the conversations continue every moment of your existence, that even moving to a remote location only reduces the noise without eliminating it entirely, because your enhanced senses can detect minds from miles away. This is Edward's reality, even when he isolates himself, when he retreats to the deepest wilderness. He must travel many miles from any human or vampire presence to achieve something approaching quiet, and true silence remains impossible, because he is never beyond his own range when his family is near. He has spent his century of vampire existence developing strategies to manage this overwhelming input. The first and most essential skill is filtering, learning to push most thoughts into background noise while focusing on specific minds. It is similar to how humans can focus on one conversation in a crowded room while the others fade to ambient sound. In his early years, Edward lacked this ability, heard every mind with equal intensity, found himself drowning in the mental chaos of even small gatherings. Carlyle helped him develop control, teaching him to practice selective attention until it became automatic. Now he can walk through a crowded high school hallway and focus only on thoughts relevant to his immediate concerns, allowing the rest to wash over him without demanding his full attention. But filtering is imperfect and exhausting. It requires constant effort, constant discipline. In moments of distraction or emotional intensity, his control slips and the full weight of surrounding minds crashes into his awareness. When he is angry or frightened or overwhelmed, he loses the ability to tune out the noise and hears everything at once with terrible clarity. Even under normal circumstances, filtering is not true silence, but merely reduction. He can turn down the volume, but never achieve the quiet that humans experience when alone. The thoughts are always there, always accessible, always pressing against his consciousness, demanding acknowledgement. His gift originated from his human nature, from the qualities that defined Edward Mason before transformation. As a human, he possessed unusual perceptiveness, an ability to read people through observation and intuition that went beyond normal social intelligence. His mother Elizabeth had recognized this quality in him, had seen how her son could discern her moods and thoughts without words, how he understood people's motivations through careful attention to their behavior and expressions. He was the kind of person who knew what others were thinking, not through supernatural means, but through highly developed empathy and observation. The transformation took this natural ability and made it literal, absolute, supernatural. The venom that rewrote his body also rewrote how his mind interfaced with other minds, creating a direct connection that bypassed physical observation entirely, Where human Edward had guessed at people's thoughts with impressive accuracy, vampire Edward simply hears them without possibility of error. The same pattern holds for all vampire gifts. They emerge from human traits, amplifying something that already existed into something genuinely impossible. Edward's social perception became telepathy. Alice's intuition about future possibilities became precognition. Jasper's empathy became emotional manipulation. The gifts are not random, but rooted in who these people were before death and transformation. When Edward woke as a vampire after 3 days of burning transformation, his first experience of consciousness included Carlyle's thoughts. He heard his creator's relief that the transformation had succeeded, heard Carlyle's hope that he had made the right choice in forcing immortality on a dying boy, heard the compassion and uncertainty that defined Carlyle's inner world. It was overwhelming and confusing. This voice that was not audible sound, but appeared directly in his awareness. Edward initially believed he was hallucinating, that the transformation had damaged his mind. Only gradually, through conversation with Carlyle and observation of how the thoughts matched spoken words and actions, did he understand that he was reading minds. The early years were torture. Edward had no control, no ability to filter or focus. He heard every thought within range with equal intensity and clarity. Moving through human spaces was agony, not just because of the thirst for blood, but because of the crushing weight of mental voices. Every human he encountered broadcasted their thoughts at him. Their fears, desires, judgments, the constant stream of consciousness that defines human experience. He could not escape it, could not find peace anywhere except in the deepest isolation. Carlyle helped him develop control, but it took years before Edward could function in society, before he learned to manage the gift rather than being paralyzed by it. What he cannot hear proves as significant as what he can. Bella Swan's mind is completely silent to him, a blank space where thought should exist. When he focuses on her, when he directs his telepathy toward her consciousness, he perceives nothing. Not fuzzy thoughts or quiet thoughts, but absolute absence, as if her mind does not exist. This is unprecedented in his experience. Every other human he has encountered broadcasts their thoughts clearly. Every vampire mind is open to him, but Bella is blank, immune to his gift in ways he cannot explain or overcome. He has theories about this immunity, none confirmed. She might possess a natural shield, a mental defense that exists without conscious effort on her part, protecting her thoughts from external intrusion. Shields are rare but documented among vampires. Renata has a physical shield that prevents approach, and now Edward knows that Bella's shield, once she is transformed, will protect against mental gifts. Perhaps this shield existed in Bella as a human, dormant but effective, blocking his telepathy without her awareness. Or perhaps the immunity is specific to him, some quirk of how his gift interacts with her particular mental signature. Or perhaps she represents a category of humans whose minds operate in ways his gift cannot access, though he has never encountered another like her. The silence around Bella is both profoundly attractive and deeply frustrating. For the first time in over 100 years, Edward experiences what humans call privacy of thought. When he is with her, he exists in a bubble of quiet, her blank mind creating an oasis in the constant noise. He does not hear her judging him, fearing him, or analyzing him. He does not know her thoughts about their conversations, cannot verify whether she feels what she claims to feel, cannot be certain of her honesty or her emotions. This uncertainty is novel and terrifying. With every other person in his existence, he knows the truth beneath their words. With Bella, he must trust and guess like a human, and the vulnerability this creates is both uncomfortable and exhilarating. But telepathy has other limitations beyond Bella's immunity. Extreme distance makes reading impossible. Beyond 3 or 4 miles, minds simply disappear from his awareness. He cannot reach across countries or continents, cannot maintain connection with distant individuals. The gift requires proximity, relative closeness, minds within the sphere of his perception. He also cannot access memories directly. He hears what people are thinking in the present moment, but if they are not actively remembering something, he cannot browse through their past. He might catch memory as it surfaces in present thought, might hear someone recalling an event, but he cannot dig into their history deliberately the way Aro can through touch. Mental discipline in others affects what he hears, though it cannot block him entirely. Vampires with centuries of practice can maintain more organized thoughts, can choose what they focus on with enough control that their minds present a cleaner, more intentional stream to his telepathy. Carlyle, for instance, has learned to think clearly and purposefully, maintaining mental organization that makes his thoughts easy to follow. But even Carlyle cannot hide thoughts from Edward, cannot think something without Edward hearing it. The discipline simply makes the thoughts less chaotic, not less accessible. The gift is burden and blessing intertwined. It has saved his family countless times, providing advance warning of danger, revealing enemies' plans, allowing strategic responses that would be impossible without his insight. It allows him to know his family deeply, to understand them without words, to perceive the love and loyalty that binds them together. It protects them from exposure by detecting suspicious thoughts before they become dangerous. These benefits are real and significant, making Edward invaluable to the Cullen Coven. But the cost is isolation. He can never know true privacy, never escape into quiet contemplation, never experience the peace of solitude that even other vampires can find. He knows too much about everyone, hears their judgments and fears and secret thoughts, perceives the darkness that all people carry, but usually hide. This knowledge creates distance, makes genuine connection difficult when you can hear someone's true thoughts beneath their spoken kindness. He's surrounded by minds, drowning in consciousness and thought, yet profoundly alone in ways that only endless noise can create. In 1927, 9 years after his transformation, Edward Cullen left Carlisle and began killing humans. The decision came not from rejection of his creator's love, or from sudden embrace of his vampire nature, but from a rationalization that seemed, in his young vampire mind, perfectly logical. He'd spent nearly a decade listening to human thoughts, hearing the darkness that lurked beneath civilized surfaces, perceiving the evil that humans carried and concealed. He heard thoughts of violence, of cruelty, of desires to harm others. He heard predators among the prey, humans who were themselves monsters wearing human faces. And he believed that if he must kill to survive, he could at least make those deaths meaningful by selecting victims who deserved destruction. Carlyle's thoughts, when Edward announced his intention to leave, were devastated but resigned. Edward heard his creator's heartbreak, heard Carlyle's fear that his son was lost, heard the desperate hope that this rebellion would be temporary. But Carlyle did not try to stop him physically, did not use force or command. He simply thought his love and his sorrow, let Edward hear both, and watched his first companion walk away into the darkness. The pain in Carlyle's mind as Edward left would haunt him for the entire decade of his absence. A constant mental recording he could replay with perfect clarity, his creator's grief preserved in crystalline vampire memory. Edward traveled alone, moving through American cities in the late 1920s, hunting humans, but hunting selectively. He did not feed randomly or impulsively like typical vampires. Instead, he used his telepathy as a screening mechanism, scanning crowds for minds that revealed criminal intent or past atrocities. He listened for thoughts of planned violence, for memories of harm already inflicted, for the mental signatures of those who preyed on the innocent. When he found such a mind, when he identified someone whose thoughts revealed them as murderer or rapist or abuser, he followed them. He stalked them as they stalked their own victims, waited for the moment when they were isolated and vulnerable, then struck with vampire speed and efficiency. The first kill was a man in Chicago who was planning to murder his business partner for insurance money. Edward heard the thoughts clearly, heard the man rehearsing his alibi, imagining the death, anticipating the financial gain. Edward followed him for 3 days, listening to the increasingly detailed murder plot, waiting until the man was alone. When he killed him, Edward heard the final thoughts, confusion, terror, the realization that something impossible was happening. He drank the blood and left the body where it would be found, making it appear as though the planned victim had struck first in self-defense. Edward told himself he had saved a life, that his victim's death was justice rather than murder. The pattern repeated across months and years. Edward became a vigilante vampire, dispensing death to those he deemed worthy of it. He killed a serial rapist in Detroit, hearing the man's memories of his victims, hearing his plans for the next. He killed a child abuser in St. Louis, reading thoughts that revealed years of concealed violence. He killed gang members, corrupt officials, anyone whose mind revealed darkness sufficient to justify Edward's thirst. He rationalized each death carefully, listening to his victim's thoughts extensively before acting, convincing himself that he was not simply a predator, but an instrument of justice. Initially, this rationalization provided satisfaction. Edward felt he had found a compromise between Carlyle's impossible idealism and typical vampire predation. He was still killing humans, still satisfying the thirst with human blood that tasted infinitely better than animal blood ever had. But he was being selective, conscientious, moral about his killing. He was making the world safer, removing predators from human society, serving a purpose beyond simple feeding. The thirst was satisfied, and his conscience remained relatively clear. Or so he believed for the first years of his rebellion. But telepathy that made his vigilante system possible also ensured its eventual collapse. Edward could not simply kill criminals and forget them. He heard their final thoughts, heard their fear and confusion and pain. More significantly, he heard their memories as death approached and mental discipline dissolved. He heard the complexity of their lives, the factors that had shaped them, the humanity that existed even in the worst of them. A murderer's final thoughts included not just his crimes, but his love for his mother, his regret about the path his life had taken, his own victimization as a child. Edward heard all of it, every layer, every complication, every piece of evidence that humans are not simply good or evil, but intricate beings shaped by circumstances and choices. He also began hearing the thoughts of those connected to his victims. When a criminal disappeared, when a body was found drained of blood, family members thought about the loss. Edward, returning to cities where he had hunted, heard mothers grieving sons, heard wives wondering what had happened to missing husbands, heard children asking why their father had not come home. Even the worst humans had people who loved them, who mourned their loss, who suffered from their absence. Edward heard this suffering, heard these grieving thoughts, and could not escape the realization that he was causing pain beyond the immediate victim. The complexity wore at his certainty. He began to question his selections, to wonder whether his judgments were truly just. What defined a person as worthy of death? How many evil acts or thoughts justified Edward making himself judge and executioner? He heard the thoughts of criminals who felt genuine remorse, who were actively trying to change their behavior, who struggled against their worst impulses. He heard the internal battles humans fought against their own darkness, heard people resisting temptation, choosing difficult paths toward being better. Some of those he killed were not simply monsters, but humans in the process of moral struggle, people who might have changed if given the opportunity. The turning point came in 1931, 4 years into his rebellious decade. Edward had been tracking a man in New York whose thoughts revealed he had murdered 3 people over the past 2 years. The evidence in the man's mind was clear and damning. Detailed memories of the killings, lack of remorse, satisfaction at having escaped justice. Edward followed him for a week, listening to his thoughts, confirming that this was indeed a killer worthy of death, according to Edward's moral calculus. But during that week, Edward also heard the man's thoughts beginning to change. The killer had met someone, a woman whose kindness had affected him unexpectedly. Edward heard him thinking about her, heard genuine affection developing, heard the stirrings of conscience that her presence inspired. The man began remembering his victims differently, began feeling something that resembled guilt, began questioning the path his life had taken. He thought about confession, about turning himself in, about trying to make amends for what he had done. Edward heard these thoughts, heard the possibility of redemption beginning to take shape, heard a man who might genuinely change. And then Edward killed him anyway. He had spent a week tracking this man, had invested time and effort in the hunt, and the thirst was burning in his throat. The man's budding redemption seemed fragile, uncertain, possibly temporary. Edward rationalized that the thoughts of change were not the same as actual change, that this man had still murdered 3 people, that justice still demanded his death. So Edward attacked, drained him, and left the body in an alley where it would be discovered. But as he fed, as he heard the dying thoughts, Edward heard genuine remorse. He heard the man thinking about the woman he had been falling in love with, heard him wishing he could have been better for her, heard regret about his victims that felt authentic and deep. The final thoughts were not of a monster dying, but of a person who had begun to recognize his own monstrosity and wanted desperately to escape it. Edward had killed a man in the process of trying to become something other than a killer, had ended a life that might have found redemption, had made himself executioner of someone who might have deserved a chance. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming. Edward stood over the body, blood on his lips, and could not produce a single justification that survived honest examination. This man's evil was real, but so was his emerging conscience. Who was Edward to decide that the chance at redemption was insufficient, that 4 years of murder erased the possibility of change? He was not justice, but a predator using telepathy to select victims he could kill without feeling guilty. The entire rationalization collapsed, revealing the truth beneath it. He was a killer justifying killing, a vampire who had found a way to satisfy his thirst while maintaining the illusion of righteousness. Edward left New York that night and began traveling toward Carlisle, toward home, carrying the weight of 4 years and dozens of deaths. He spent weeks on the journey, moving slowly, reviewing every kill with his perfect vampire memory. He heard again the final thoughts of every victim, listened to the complexity he had ignored in his rush to justify their deaths. Some had been genuinely evil, lacking remorse or conscience, probably deserving whatever justice Edward provided. But others had been like the man in New York, complicated, struggling, containing both darkness and the possibility of light. Edward had killed them all indiscriminately, had used his gift to identify prey he could stomach killing, rather than to serve genuine justice. When he arrived at Carlisle's door in the autumn of 1931, Edward heard his creator's thoughts before speaking a word. He heard Carlisle's overwhelming relief that Edward had returned, heard the forgiveness that Carlisle had already extended, heard the absence of judgment or condemnation. Carlisle had known Edward would return, had hoped and believed that his son's conscience would eventually overcome his rationalizations. He had waited patiently, never giving up hope, holding the space for Edward's return without condition or requirement. Edward heard all of this in Carlisle's mind, heard the pure love and faith that had sustained his creator through 4 years of waiting. They did not discuss the rebellious years extensively. Carlisle asked no questions about how many Edward had killed or who his victims had been. He simply welcomed his son home, thought his love and acceptance, and helped Edward return to the vegetarian lifestyle. The transition back to animal blood was difficult after 4 years of human blood, the thirst more challenging to manage, the satisfaction less complete. But Edward embraced the difficulty as deserved penance, as the price of returning to the path he should never have abandoned. The perfect memory that is the curse of vampire existence means Edward carries every death with him still. He remembers each victim perfectly, remembers their final thoughts, remembers the complexity he chose to ignore. He cannot forget or diminish these memories. They remain as vivid as the night he created them, permanent recordings of his worst decisions. He uses this guilt deliberately, allows it to strengthen his resolve, lets it remind him of what he is capable of when he indulges his nature rather than restraining it. This is why Edward judges himself more harshly than any other family member judges themselves, why he considers himself the most dangerous Cullen, why he fears his own darkness more than he fears external threats. He knows what he did, knows what he is, knows that his ability to rationalize killing makes him potentially more dangerous than vampires who kill without pretense of morality. The thoughts he wishes he could unhear are not those of his victims, but his own thoughts from those years, his own rationalizations and justifications, the voice in his own mind that made murder seem righteous. That voice frightens him more than any external threat ever could, because he knows it could speak again if he allows himself to weaken, to compromise, to believe that killing can ever truly be made moral through careful selection of victims. Living among family when you can hear every thought creates an intimacy that goes beyond anything humans experience, a connection so complete that privacy becomes impossible and secrets become futile. Edward knows his family in ways they do not fully know themselves, hearing not just what they choose to share, but what they think in unguarded moments, what crosses their minds when they believe no one is watching. He hears their love and their irritations, their noble thoughts and their petty ones, the constant stream of consciousness that defines each family member's inner world. This knowledge is both gift and burden, creating bonds of deep understanding, while also making him witness to things perhaps better left unobserved. Carlyle's thoughts are the easiest for Edward to be around, the most peaceful to hear. His creator's mind operates with remarkable clarity and organization, centuries of practice creating mental discipline that makes his thoughts almost restful despite their complexity. When Carlyle performs surgery, Edward can hear the medical analysis running parallel to the procedure. Anatomical assessment, consideration of techniques, awareness of patient vitals, all processed simultaneously without confusion. But beneath the medical thinking runs a constant current of compassion, genuine concern for the human life in his hands, satisfaction at being able to heal rather than harm. Carlyle's thoughts contain no cruelty, no casual dismissal of human value, no predatory impulses left unexamined. Edward also hears Carlyle's fatherly concern broadcasting toward all his adopted children, the patriarch's constant awareness of his family's well-being. When Edward enters a room, he hears Carlyle's immediate assessment. Is Edward struggling with thirst? Is he content? Does he need support? All automatic thoughts of a father monitoring his child. Carlyle thinks about family dynamics constantly, worrying about tensions, celebrating connections, strategizing about how to maintain harmony among such different personalities. He thinks about their safety, about potential threats, about the balance between integration into human society and the risks that integration creates. His thoughts reveal a mind that carries enormous responsibility with quiet grace, that leads through example rather than authority, that views his coven as family rather than subjects. The philosophical reflections that occupy Carlyle's mind during quiet moments reveal the depth of his internal life. Edward hears him considering questions of morality and existence, wrestling with theological concepts, analyzing whether vampires have souls and what their purpose might be in a world designed for mortals. Carlyle thinks about redemption, about whether their vegetarian lifestyle constitutes genuine atonement or merely reduction of harm, about what justice means when applied to immortal beings. These thoughts show Edward the framework that supports Carlyle's choices, the genuine belief system that makes his seemingly impossible compassion sustainable across centuries. Carlyle's memories surface in his thoughts occasionally, fragmentary recalls of his long existence. Edward has heard him remember his human father, the cruel pastor whose fanaticism shaped Carlyle's early life. He has heard Carlyle think about the sewers beneath London, about the vampire attack that transformed him, about the centuries of loneliness before he created Edward. These memories explain Carlyle in ways conversation never could, reveal the experiences that forged his philosophy, show why he values family so intensely after spending so long alone. Edward respects Carlyle above all others, partly because he knows the thoughts behind the actions. Here's the integrity that defines every decision. Esme's mental landscape is warmth made conscious, maternal love broadcasting in all directions, whether she intends it or not. Her thoughts toward each family member carry specific affection. Worry about Edward's brooding, delight in Alice's enthusiasm, amusement at Emmett's antics, understanding of Rosalie's pain, concern about Jasper's struggles. She thinks of them as her children, despite some being nearly as old as she is, despite the lack of biological connection. The maternal instinct survived her transformation intact, intensified by the loss of her human infant son, redirected toward the family Carlyle built around her. When Esme looks at spaces, Edward hears her mind immediately begin redesigning them. She thinks in aesthetic terms constantly, seeing not what is, but what could be, how moving a wall would improve flow, how different lighting would change mood, how specific furniture would create warmth. Her thoughts, while renovating their various homes, are focused and creative, imagining possibilities, calculating structural requirements, considering each family member's needs and preferences. She thinks about creating sanctuary, about building spaces where vampires can feel at home despite their fundamental displacement from the human world they inhabit. But beneath the design thoughts and maternal warmth, Edward hears the grief Esme carries quietly. She thinks about her human son, the infant who died and whose death drove her to the suicide attempt that ended her human life. The memories surface rarely, only in unguarded moments, but they remain vivid and painful. Edward hears her wonder what her son would have become, hears her acknowledge that her vampire children have filled the void without erasing it. The loss shaped her, made her treasure family even more intensely, made her determined to protect what she has been given in this second existence. Rosalie's mind is the most complicated in the family, layered with beauty and bitterness, vanity and vulnerability intertwined in ways that create constant internal conflict. She thinks about her appearance frequently, aware of her extraordinary beauty, taking satisfaction in it, while also resenting what it cost her. Edward hears her admiring herself in mirrors, while simultaneously thinking about how her beauty attracted the men who assaulted her, how it made her a target, how it defines her in ways she cannot escape. The vanity is real, but so is the awareness that beauty has been both gift and curse throughout her existence. The resentment about vampirism runs through Rosalie's thoughts like a constant undercurrent. She thinks about what she lost, the ability to age, to have children, to experience the normal human life she'd been on the verge of beginning. When she sees human women who are pregnant or with children, Edward hears her thoughts twist with envy and grief, hear her wish desperately that she could have what they have. She thinks about the unfairness of being saved from death only to lose everything that made life worth living. The bitterness is not directed at Carlyle, who she recognizes acted from compassion, but at circumstance, at the cruelty of being preserved in a form that cannot create life. Yet Edward also hears Rosalie's fierce protectiveness toward Emmett, thoughts of pure devotion uncomplicated by the resentment that colors most of her mental landscape. When she looks at her mate, her thoughts soften completely, become tender and simple. She thinks about his smile, about his strength, about how he makes immortality bearable. She thinks about carrying him wounded to Carlisle, about her fear that he would die before transformation completed, about her overwhelming relief when he woke. Emmett is her anchor, the one purely good thing in her vampire existence, and her thoughts about him reveal the capacity for love that survives beneath all her pain. Edward understands Rosalie better than she realizes, hears the vulnerability beneath her hard exterior, knows that her sharpness is defense rather than cruelty. She judges Bella harshly, thinks critical thoughts about Edward's relationship with a human. But Edward hears the fear beneath the judgment, fear that Bella will choose vampirism and regret it as Rosalie regrets it. Fear that Edward is condemning someone he loves to the loss Rosalie experiences daily. The understanding does not make Rosalie's thoughts easier to hear, but it provides context, shows Edward the wounded person beneath the beautiful, sharp surface. Emmett's mind is the simplest in the family, and therefore the most restful for Edward to be around. His thoughts are straightforward and uncomplicated, dominated by enthusiasm and humor. He thinks about competitions and challenges, about physical activities that test his strength, about the next wrestling match with his brothers or the next hunting trip. His thoughts carry no hidden layers, no unspoken resentments, no complex emotional processing. What Emmett thinks is what Emmett is: joyful, competitive, loyal, uncomplicated. When Emmett thinks about Rosalie, which he does frequently, his thoughts are pure, adoration without qualification or doubt. He thinks she's the most beautiful creature that has ever existed, and cannot believe his fortune in being her mate. He thinks about making her smile, about protecting her despite her being perfectly capable of protecting herself, about spending forever with her. The devotion is complete and unquestioning, the mate bond expressing itself through Emmett's naturally optimistic temperament. Edward hears no doubts in Emmett's mind about their relationship, no concerns about compatibility or future, just simple certainty that Rosalie is his and he is hers, and this is exactly how things should be. Emmett's thoughts toward Edward carry brotherly affection, mixed with friendly competition. He thinks about challenging Edward to various contests, thinks about how Edward's telepathy gives him unfair advantages, thinks about strategies to win despite Edward knowing his plans. The competitive thoughts are never hostile, always playful, part of how Emmett expresses connection. He thinks of Edward as his brother, thinks protective thoughts when Edward seems troubled, offers uncomplicated support through thought that matches the verbal encouragement he provides. Of all the family members, Emmett's mind is the one Edward can relax around most completely, knowing he will hear nothing but genuine goodwill. Alice's mind is rapid-fire chaos, present thoughts constantly interrupted by visions of possible futures. Edward hears her notice a dress and immediately sees 3 different futures where someone wears similar styles. Hears her think about tomorrow's weather while simultaneously seeing 4 possible weather patterns depending on variables she is tracking. Her consciousness exists partially in the present and partially in branching futures, creating a mental experience unlike anyone else in the family. Reading Alice's mind requires Edward to distinguish between what she thinks about now and what she sees about later, between current awareness and precognitive vision. The visions themselves appear in her thoughts as images and impressions rather than complete narratives, fragmentary glimpses that Alice interprets through practice and intuition. Edward sees what she sees, helps her interpret unclear visions, provides second opinions when she is uncertain whether a vision represents definite future or mere possibility. The collaboration between telepathy and precognition has saved the family repeatedly, the combination of their gifts providing more complete intelligence than either could achieve alone. Beneath the visions and the cheerful exterior, Edward hears Alice's grief about her absent human memories. She thinks about the blank space where her early life should be, wonders who she was before transformation, wishes she knew her human name or her family or the circumstances that led to her becoming vampire. The mystery troubles her more than she admits aloud, creates an uncertainty about identity that even her visions of the future cannot resolve. Edward keeps these thoughts private, respects Alice's unspoken wish that the family not know how much the amnesia bothers her. Jasper's mind carries the weight of a violent past, thoughts frequently returning to his decades with Maria and the newborn wars. Edward hears him remember creating vampires meant to die, hears him relive the guilt of destroying newborns once they outlived their usefulness, hears the accumulated trauma of feeling every death through his empathic gift. Jasper's thoughts reveal constant battle with his nature, the thirst burning more intensely in him than in any other family member, the vegetarian lifestyle requiring effort that sometimes feels unsustainable. Edward hears him calculate how long since his last hunt, hears him assess his control, hears the fear that he will slip and harm someone. But Edward also hears Jasper's determination, his commitment to being worthy of Alyssa's faith in him, his gratitude toward the family that accepted him despite his darkness. Jasper thinks about Edward with understanding, recognizing shared experience of leaving Carlisle and returning, knowing they both carry guilt about the humans they killed. The brotherhood between them is built on this shared darkness, on mutual understanding that they are the family members most likely to fail, most aware of the monster beneath the civilized surface. Edward values Jasper's thoughts because they reflect his own fears, validate his concerns, remind him he is not alone in his struggle. The first time Edward Cullen encountered a mind he could not read, he believed his gift had failed. It was January of 2005, in a biology classroom at Forks High School, on what should have been an unremarkable day in the endless cycle of high school attendance. Edward sat at his lab table, idly monitoring the thoughts of students filing into class, performing the usual scan that had become automatic over a century of practice. He heard Mike Newton thinking about asking Jessica to a dance, heard Angela Weber worrying about a history exam, heard the teacher mentally reviewing the day's lesson plan. Every mind within range broadcasted clearly, thoughts flowing into his awareness as they always did. Then Bella Swan walked into the classroom, and where her thoughts should have been, Edward found nothing. The silence was absolute. He focused on her specifically, directing his telepathy toward her consciousness with deliberate intensity, searching for the mental voice that every human possessed. He found only blankness, an absence so complete it felt like a hole in the fabric of perception. His gift did not receive fuzzy or unclear thoughts from her. It received nothing at all, as though her mind simply did not exist. The shock was profound. In over 90 years of vampire existence, Edward had never encountered a mind he could not access. Every human, every vampire, every conscious being within his range had always been an open book. But Bella Swan's pages were blank. His first assumption was that something was wrong with his ability, that perhaps he was experiencing some kind of telepathic malfunction. He immediately tested his gift on everyone else in the classroom, scanning rapidly through present minds. Mike Newton's thoughts came through clearly. Jealousy that Tyler Crowley was also interested in the new girl. Jessica Stanley's thoughts were sharp. Assessment of Bella as potential friend or rival. The teacher's thoughts continued their professional focus. Every other mind functioned normally, broadcasting clearly, accessible as they had always been. Only Bella remained silent. Only her consciousness refused to reveal itself. Edward tried repeatedly throughout that first class to penetrate whatever barrier protected her thoughts. He focused intensely, ignoring the lesson, directing all his telepathic attention toward her. He searched for any trace of mental presence, any whisper of thought, any indication that consciousness existed behind her brown eyes. He found nothing. She sat 3 seats away, close enough that her thoughts should be as clear as spoken words, and yet she was utterly, impossibly silent. The frustration built quickly. He was accustomed to knowing what people thought, to having immediate access to their reactions and opinions. The sudden inability to read someone created a sense of blindness, of being cut off from information he relied on constantly. But beneath the frustration was something else, something unexpected and profound. The silence around Bella was peaceful. For the first time in 90 years, Edward sat in a crowded room and experienced genuine quiet. The constant mental noise that defined his existence dimmed slightly in her presence, her blank mind creating a small oasis of calm in the endless broadcast. He could still hear everyone else, still process the dozens of thoughts from surrounding students. But Bella's silence created a pocket of rest, a space where at least one consciousness was not demanding his attention. The peace was seductive, dangerous, the first hint of something he had not experienced since his human life: privacy. The mystery of her immunity consumed him immediately. Edward had always understood his gift, had accepted it as simply part of his nature. He heard thoughts because that was what his particular vampire ability did, and everyone fell within its scope. The existence of an exception challenged everything he understood about his telepathy. If Bella was immune, could others be? Had he simply never encountered another shielded mind in 90 years? Or was Bella genuinely unique? The questions multiplied without answers, each attempt to read her thoughts resulting only in more frustration and confusion. He began testing theories. Perhaps distance affected his ability to read her specifically. He moved closer when possible, monitoring whether proximity changed anything. It did not. He tried reading her. When she was distracted, when she was focused, when she was emotional or calm. Her mind remained equally blank under all conditions. He observed her for signs of mental discipline or awareness that she was blocking him. She showed none. Bella appeared completely unaware that she possessed any kind of mental shield, moved through the world without any indication that she was different from every other human Edward had encountered. The scientific approach to understanding her immunity gradually gave way to something less rational. Edward found himself drawn to Bella, not despite her silence, but because of it. When he sat near her, when he existed within the quiet space her blank mind created, he experienced a form of peace that had been absent from his existence since transformation. The constant mental assault that defined his daily experience diminished slightly in her presence. He could focus on his own thoughts without the interference of dozens of others, could exist for brief moments without being overwhelmed by the consciousness surrounding him. This attraction was dangerous, and he knew it. The peace Bella's silence provided was not the only thing drawing him to her. Her scent called to his thirst more powerfully than any human he had encountered in decades, her blood singing to his vampire nature in ways that made control difficult. The combination of factors, the irresistible scent and the blessed silence, created a pull toward her that was both profound and terrifying. He wanted to be near her because she was the only quiet place in a noisy world. But being near her meant constant battle with a thirst that demanded he kill her. Without access to her thoughts, Edward was forced to rely on observation and interpretation in ways he hadn't needed to since his human life. He watched her facial expressions, studied her body language, listened to vocal tone and inflection. He became expert at reading the physical signs of emotion and intention, rediscovering skills that telepathy had made obsolete. The process was frustratingly imprecise compared to simply hearing thoughts, but it was also engaging in unexpected ways. There was challenge in trying to understand her, mystery in not knowing for certain what she was thinking or feeling. He could still learn about Bella through other people's thoughts, reading her by reflection in the minds that surrounded her. Jessica Stanley thought extensively about Bella, assessing her personality, judging her choices, forming opinions that Edward could access even if Bella's own thoughts remained hidden. Mike Newton's attraction to Bella came through clearly in his thoughts, his hopes and plans, providing Edward with information about Bella's responses and reactions. Angela Weber's kind observations offered insight into Bella's character through the lens of genuine friendship. The teacher's assessments, the other students' passing thoughts, all created a composite picture of Bella Swan built from external perspectives rather than internal access. But second-hand information could not satisfy Edward's need to understand her. He wanted to know what she thought about him, whether she found him frightening or attractive, or simply strange. He wanted to know if she suspected what he was, if the coldness of his skin or the gold of his eyes triggered any recognition of his inhuman nature. He wanted to know her opinion of Fawkes, of her father, of her new life. He wanted access to the internal monologue that defined her consciousness, the stream of thought that he could hear from every other person, but remained forever silent from her. The theories about why Bella was immune to his telepathy multiplied as Edward observed her over weeks and months. The most likely explanation was that she possessed a natural shield, a mental defense that existed without her conscious awareness or effort. Shields were rare among vampires. Renata protected Aro physically, creating distortions that prevented approach, and even rarer among humans. But perhaps Bella represented one of those exceptional humans whose consciousness operated differently, whose mental structure included defenses that blocked external intrusion. If this were true, it suggested her shield was not specific to Edward, but would protect her from any mental gift, a general immunity rather than particular resistance to his telepathy. An alternative theory was that Edward's gift had limitations he had never encountered before, that perhaps some small percentage of humans were simply inaccessible to him, and he had been fortunate enough not to meet any until Bella. This explanation suggested his telepathy was less comprehensive than he had believed, that there were categories of consciousness his gift could not reach. It was humbling to consider, challenging to accept that his ability had bounds he had not discovered in 90 years of use. The most troubling theory was that something about Bella specifically interfered with his gift, that perhaps she was not shielded, but rather that Edward's telepathy failed around her for reasons unique to their interaction. This would mean his inability to read her was personal rather than general, tied to who she was in relation to who he was. Edward found this explanation unsettling because it suggested destiny or fate, concepts he was reluctant to accept despite his century of supernatural existence. Carlyle offered perspective when Edward finally discussed Bella's immunity with him. His creator's thoughts were characteristically measured and thoughtful, considering the various possibilities without jumping to conclusions. Carlyle suggested that if Bella did possess a natural shield, transformation might amplify it the way transformation amplified all human traits into vampire gifts. The shield that protected her thoughts as a human might become something more powerful as a vampire, perhaps even extensible to others. The speculation proved remarkably accurate, but at the time it simply added another layer to the mystery of how Bella's mind worked. The frustration of not knowing Bella's thoughts was matched by a growing appreciation for the uncertainty itself. With every other person Edward had known intimately, he had possessed complete access to their internal world. He heard Carlyle's thoughts, Esme's, his siblings. He knew them more completely than they knew themselves, heard their unspoken fears and secret hopes. But with Bella, he had to trust what she told him, had to accept her words without verification, had to believe her feelings without being able to confirm them through direct access to her consciousness. This created vulnerability that was both uncomfortable and strangely appealing. The inability to verify Bella's emotions meant Edward had to trust her in ways he had never needed to trust anyone. When she said she loved him, he could not hear the thought behind the words, could not confirm that her spoken feelings matched her internal reality. When she claimed she was not afraid of him, he had to accept the statement without being able to scan her mind for hidden fear. This trust was difficult for someone who had spent a century having immediate access to truth, who had never needed to wonder whether words matched thoughts, because he heard both simultaneously. But the trust was also liberating in unexpected ways. Edward's relationships with family members were shaped by his knowledge of their every thought, by awareness of momentary irritations or passing judgments that they never intended to share. He knew when Rosalie thought cruel things about him, knew when Jasper questioned his choices, knew every minor resentment or criticism because he heard them all. With Bella, he was free from that excessive knowledge. If she had critical thoughts about him, if she experienced doubt or frustration, he did not know unless she chose to share it. The relationship existed on terms closer to human relationships, built on communication and choice rather than involuntary transparency. The silence around Bella became Edward's sanctuary. When he was with her, When he sat close enough that her presence dominated his immediate awareness, he experienced the closest thing to peace his vampire existence allowed. He could focus on her, on their conversation, on the present moment without being overwhelmed by the mental noise that usually surrounded him. Other minds still broadcast within his range, but they receded in importance when Bella was near, became background static rather than demanding presence. She was rest for a mind that had known no rest in 90 years, quiet in a life defined by endless noise. This dependence on her silence was dangerous. Edward recognized that he was becoming addicted to being near her, that the peace she provided was creating a need that would be difficult to break. If he ever had to leave her, if circumstances forced separation, he would return to the full weight of constant telepathy without the relief her presence provided. The quiet she offered would be lost, and he would remember it forever with his perfect vampire memory, would know exactly what he was missing for the rest of his immortal existence. But despite the danger, despite the risk of dependence and the threat his nature posed to her life, Edward could not force himself to stay away. The silence was too precious, too profound, too necessary. For a century, he had drowned in other people's thoughts, had endured the constant mental assault without escape or relief. Bella Swan offered him what he had believed impossible, a mind he could not read, a consciousness that did not demand his attention, a presence that created peace instead of noise. She was mystery in quiet and rest, the only silent place in his impossibly loud existence. And though he knew he should protect her by leaving, though his love demanded he remove the danger his presence created, he found himself unable to abandon the one person who could not think at him, the singular human whose mind was blessedly, impossibly, perfectly silent. High school is torture for Edward Cullen, and not primarily because of the thirst or the constant performance of humanity. The true agony is the mental assault, the unrelenting bombardment of teenage consciousness that fills every moment within the building's walls. Adolescent minds are uniquely chaotic, driven by hormonal surges and social anxieties that create mental noise of particular intensity and banality. Edward has attended high school dozens of times across his decades of existence, has endured countless iterations of the same classes and the same shallow preoccupations, and each repetition is made unbearable by his inability to escape the thoughts that surround him. The hormonal chaos of teenage minds creates a specific kind of mental pollution. Edward hears the constant undercurrent of sexual preoccupation that dominates adolescent consciousness, the intrusive thoughts and fantasies that teenagers experience but rarely voice. He hears boys thinking about girls in ways both crude and hopeful, hears girls assessing boys and comparing them and imagining scenarios. The thoughts are not evil or even particularly unusual, simply the normal function of human development, but their volume and intensity make them difficult to ignore. Every classroom contains dozens of minds experiencing attraction, rejection, desire, all broadcasting their feelings without filter or restraint. Beyond the sexual preoccupation, Edward hears the social anxieties that consume teenage consciousness. Every student is hyper-aware of their position in the school's social hierarchy, constantly monitoring who likes them and who doesn't, who is talking about them and what is being said. He hears the desperation for acceptance, the fear of humiliation, the carefully constructed personas that teenagers believe will protect them from judgment. The concerns are simultaneously trivial and all-consuming in teenage minds, creating a paradox where Edward must take seriously things he knows from experience are utterly meaningless in the scope of a full life. The repetitive nature of teenage thoughts makes the mental noise even more tedious. Edward has heard versions of the same preoccupations hundreds of times across his many cycles through high school. Every generation believes their problems are unique, that their particular social dramas and romantic entanglements are unprecedented in human experience. But from Edward's perspective, having lived through decades of adolescence, the thoughts are all variations on the same themes. Different names, same concerns. Different faces, same fears. The conviction that this moment, this relationship, this crisis will define everything. Repeated endlessly by minds too young to understand that nearly nothing from high school actually matters in retrospect. He hears students worry about prom dates, about what they will wear, about whether they will be asked or rejected. He hears them obsess over grades, not because they care about learning, but because they care about how grades affect their social standing or college prospects. He hears them strategize about parties, about who to invite and who to exclude, about how to gain access to gatherings they have not been invited to. The thoughts are legitimate concerns from the students' perspectives, genuine anxieties that feel important in the moment. But Edward, who has lived through world wars and personal tragedies and genuine crises, finds it nearly impossible to care about homecoming or who said what about whom in the cafeteria. The mental assault becomes worse during passing periods when the hallways fill with students. Hundreds of minds in close proximity create a wall of sound that Edward must filter constantly, pushing most thoughts into background noise while monitoring for anything relevant to family safety. He hears fragments of conversation that never actually happened. Students mentally replaying exchanges and imagining better responses. He hears grudges and grievances, petty anger about perceived slights, plans for minor revenges like spreading rumors or social exclusion. The cruelty of teenage thinking appears in these unspoken thoughts more clearly than in actual behavior, exposing the casual willingness to harm others for social advantage. The teachers provide little relief from the mental chaos. Edward hears their thoughts during class, and many are simply enduring rather than engaging with their work. Some teachers have long since burned out, mentally counting years until retirement, resenting their students and their administration equally. He hears them think about how much they are underpaid, about how students have become more difficult over the years, about their own personal problems that have nothing to do with education. Some think inappropriate thoughts about students, attractions they would never act on but that exist nonetheless in their consciousness. Edward finds these thoughts particularly disturbing, markers of people who should not be in positions of authority over adolescents. But a few teachers genuinely care about their work, think about how to reach struggling students, consider new approaches to explaining difficult concepts. Edward respects these educators, appreciates hearing minds that are actually engaged with the purpose of education, rather than simply performing required duties. Mr. Varner, despite his awkward manner, thinks carefully about how to make trigonometry accessible. Mrs. Goff truly enjoys literature and wants to share that enthusiasm with students who mostly think her class is boring. These teachers make the endless cycle of high school slightly more bearable because their thoughts demonstrate that not everyone in the building is simply waiting for the day to end. The social dynamics of high school become absurdly transparent when Edward can hear both sides of every interaction. He watches students have conversations while hearing what they actually think, observes the gap between spoken words and internal reactions. Someone compliments another person's outfit while thinking it looks terrible. Someone agrees to attend a party while thinking of excuses to cancel later. Someone laughs at a joke they don't find funny, performs interest in a topic they find boring, pretends to like people they secretly despise. The performance of social interaction, the constant gap between thought and speech, creates a landscape of deception that everyone participates in, but no one acknowledges. Edward also hears the genuine cruelty, the thoughts of social manipulation and teenage meanness that humans engage in while maintaining innocent exteriors. He hears students plan to embarrass others, hears them spread rumors they know are false, hears them exclude people deliberately to assert social dominance. He hears the thoughts behind bullying, the calculations about who is vulnerable and how to exploit that vulnerability for entertainment or status. The cruelty is often casual rather than malicious, teenagers not fully understanding the impact of their actions. But Edward hears it all and cannot intervene without revealing knowledge he should not possess. The few genuine friendships, the real connections between students who actually care about each other, stand out sharply against the background of performance and manipulation. Edward hears Angela Weber's thoughts toward her friends, genuine affection and concern without hidden agenda. He hears some students think protective thoughts about siblings, loyal thoughts about long-term friends, supportive thoughts towards struggling classmates. These moments of authentic goodness make the rest more tolerable. Remind Edward that humans are capable of genuine kindness even during the difficult years of adolescence. The crushing monotony of repeated attendance creates its own suffering. Edward takes the same classes decade after decade, sits through lessons he has heard dozens of times, completes assignments that hold no challenge or interest. He has studied calculus so many times he could teach it himself. He has read the assigned literature countless times, analyzed the same books through the same pedagogical approaches, written essays about themes he understood completely decades ago. The teachers believe they are presenting new material, believe their particular approach is fresh or innovative. Edward hears these thoughts and knows that every approach has been tried before, that there is truly nothing new in high school curriculum, despite constant minor modifications. The students believe their problems are unique, but Edward hears the same concerns he heard in the 1950s, the same fears he encountered in the 1980s. The technology changes, the cultural references shift, but the fundamental preoccupations of adolescence remain constant. Someone is always worried about being unpopular. Someone is always heartbroken over romantic rejection. Someone is always anxious about tests or college applications or what others think of them. The specifics differ, but the patterns repeat endlessly, creating a cycle of sameness that would be unbearable even without the constant mental noise. Yet despite the torture, despite the tedium and the mental assault and the crushing repetition, high school serves necessary purposes for the Cullens. The social integration it provides, helps maintain their human facade, creates the appearance of normal family life that protects them from suspicion. Attending school puts them in daily contact with humans, forces them to practice control in challenging environments, maintains the discipline required to exist among prey without hunting. The difficulty is not incidental but functional, training that keeps them sharp and controlled. Edward's telepathy also makes high school worthwhile by providing security for the family. He monitors constantly for suspicion about their nature, listening for thoughts that suggest someone has noticed they never eat, that their skin is too cold, that they are too beautiful or too perfect. He hears when someone wonders why the Cullens never go to the beach, when someone notices they are absent on sunny days, when someone finds them strange or unsettling. Most suspicious thoughts are fleeting and dismissed quickly, but Edward tracks them all, ensuring none develop into genuine threats. He has prevented exposure countless times through advance warning provided by reading thoughts. When a student planned to follow them home out of curiosity, Edward knew in advance and the family adjusted their route. When a teacher grew suspicious about their frequent absences, Edward heard the concern developing, and Carlyle provided medical documentation before questions became official. When someone decided to research the Cullen family history online, Edward knew immediately, and Alice prepared cover stories. The constant monitoring is exhausting but essential. The price of living among humans while hiding what they are. The benefit of preventing exposure makes the torture bearable, transforms suffering into purpose. Edward endures the mental assault of teenage consciousness because it protects his family, because his ability to hear threats before they materialize keeps them safe. He sits through classes he has taken countless times, because maintaining the facade of normal teenage life is necessary for their continued existence in Forks. He listens to the repetitive thoughts and shallow concerns, because somewhere in that noise might be the one thought that indicates danger, the one moment of suspicion that could grow into genuine threat if not addressed immediately. So Edward returns to high school year after year, decade after decade, enduring what must be endured. He filters the hormonal chaos, ignores the petty concerns, monitors for threats while appearing to be just another bored teenager counting the minutes until the bell rings. He knows every thought he will hear before he hears it, knows every concern that will dominate teenage consciousness, knows that nothing will be new or surprising or interesting, but he also knows that his family's safety depends on this constant vigilance, this endless monitoring, this torture of high school attendance, made worse by the gift that allows him to hear everything, to know everything, to endure it all without escape or relief. The silence that Bella Swan provides becomes even more precious in this context, even more necessary. The only quiet space in an existence defined by the overwhelming noise of minds too young to know how little their current crisis will matter in the vast sweep of time. Edward's telepathy reveals the truth of vampire nature, not just in others, but in himself, exposing the predatory consciousness that lurks beneath civilized behavior. When he encounters vampires who embrace their nature without guilt or restraint, when he reads the minds of those who hunt humans as casually as humans swat mosquitoes, he confronts what he could become if he allowed his control to slip. These minds are mirrors showing his potential darkness, warnings written in thought rather than words, reminders that the monster is not separate from him but is him, held at bay only through constant vigilance and the choice to value human life despite every instinct demanding otherwise. James's mind was pure predation, consciousness stripped of everything except the hunt. Edward read his thoughts during the baseball game when James's coven stumbled upon the Cullens mid-game, and what he heard was fundamentally alien to the way Edward tried to exist. James thought about Bella the way a wolf thinks about a particularly challenging elk, with focus that bordered on obsession but contained no malice or cruelty. He simply enjoyed the chase, found satisfaction in pursuit, experienced hunting as the ultimate expression of his nature. When Bella's scent reached him, when he recognized her as Edward's mate, and therefore a worthy target, his thoughts became singular in their focus. Every calculation, every strategy, every moment of consciousness oriented toward catching her. Edward heard James's memories of past hunts surface as he planned his pursuit of Bella. He had hunted for centuries, selecting challenging prey deliberately, seeking victims who would run or fight or hide. The difficulty was the point. James could have killed easily and often, could have satisfied his thirst without effort, but he chose targets that required skill and planning because the challenge made the hunt meaningful. Edward heard him remember other pursuits, other prey who had tried to escape, heard the satisfaction James took in tracking them across distances, in anticipating their moves, in finally catching them despite their best efforts. The memories contained no guilt, no recognition that his victims were people with lives and loved ones. They were simply prey, obstacles in a game James played for his own entertainment. Reading James's thoughts forced Edward to confront uncomfortable truths about vampire nature. This was what vampires were designed to be: hunters who enjoyed hunting, predators who found satisfaction in pursuit and kill. James was not abnormal or sick or corrupted. He was simply being vampire without the overlay of human morality that vampires like Carlyle and Edward tried to maintain. The thoughts Edward heard from James could have been his own thoughts if he had not chosen to fight his nature, if he had embraced predation rather than resisting it. James was the cautionary tale Edward needed, proof of what happened when a vampire accepted their design rather than struggling against it. Victoria's mind after James's death revealed a different aspect of vampire nature: the absolute devastation of losing a mate. Edward read her thoughts when she began hunting Bella for revenge, and what he heard was grief transformed into purpose. The mate bond that had connected her to James broke when he died, leaving a wound that would never heal, an absence that defined her existence more powerfully than any presence ever had. She thought about James constantly, remembered their hunts together, felt the phantom sensation of a bond that no longer existed. The pain was unbearable, and rather than seeking her own destruction as many vampires do after losing mates, Victoria channeled the agony into vengeance. Her thoughts were strategic beneath the emotional chaos. Edward heard her planning the newborn army, calculating how to use inexperienced vampires as weapons against the Cullens, considering variables and contingencies. She thought about Riley, the young vampire she was manipulating into loyalty and love, using him as tool rather than genuine companion. Victoria was intelligent, patient, willing to take years to achieve her revenge if necessary, but beneath the strategy ran the constant current of grief and rage, the mate bond's absence creating a void that vengeance could fill but never satisfy. Edward heard in her thoughts what losing Bella would do to him, understood that Victoria's obsession was mirror of what his own mind would become if Bella died. The Volturi's thoughts during the Cullens' visit to Volterra exposed the consciousness of truly ancient vampires, minds that had existed for millennia and viewed the world through perspectives so alien they were almost incomprehensible. Aro's thoughts were layered and complex, running multiple calculations simultaneously, assessing every interaction for advantage. When he touched Edward's hand and read his thoughts, Edward simultaneously read Aro's reaction: fascination with Edward's gift, desire to possess it for the Volturi guard, calculations about how to acquire Edward through persuasion or force. Aro thought in terms of centuries and millennia, planned strategies that would unfold over decades, viewed individual vampires as resources to be collected or eliminated based solely on their utility to Volturi power. Caius's mind was simpler but darker, characterized by casual cruelty and profound boredom. Edward heard him think about the Cullens with contempt, viewing their vegetarian lifestyle as weakness and self-delusion. Caius had lived for over 3,000 years, had witnessed empires rise and fall, had killed so many humans and vampires that individual deaths held no meaning for him. He thought about destruction the way humans think about mundane tasks, considering who should be eliminated with the same emotional investment someone might give to deciding what to eat for dinner. The boredom in his thoughts was profound, centuries of existence creating a jadedness that found entertainment only in violence and exercises of power. Marcus's consciousness was the most tragic Edward had ever encountered. The ancient vampire's thoughts were consumed by overwhelming emptiness, by the absence of Didim and the mate bond that had given his existence meaning. Edward heard Marcus thinking about death constantly, wishing for destruction but unable to achieve it, trapped in immortal existence that held no purpose or joy. Marcus's gift allowed him to see the bonds between others, to perceive love and loyalty and connection, which made his own isolation even more unbearable. He saw what others had and knew he would never have it again, understood connection intimately while being utterly disconnected himself. Chelsea's gift kept Marcus bound to the Volturi through artificially maintained loyalty, but Edward heard that without her manipulation, Marcus would simply walk away and seek whatever ending he could find. Jane's thoughts revealed sadistic satisfaction in causing pain, pleasure taken in watching others suffer through the illusion she created. Edward heard her preparing to use her gift on him, heard her anticipation of his agony, heard the enjoyment she derived from watching powerful beings reduced to helplessness. Jane had been burned at the stake as a human child, had experienced terrible pain before Aro rescued and transformed her. The trauma created her gift, but it also created her personality. Someone who had suffered and now inflicted suffering as both defense and entertainment. Edward heard in her thoughts the wounded child beneath the cruel vampire, understood that her sadism was armor protecting her from ever being vulnerable again. Alec's mind was colder, more detached. Where Jane embraced sensation through inflicting pain, Alec removed all sensation through his gift. Edward heard him think about his ability with clinical detachment, considering it a tool rather than expression of emotion. Alec felt less than Jane, seemed to have responded to their shared trauma by disconnecting from feeling rather than weaponizing it. His thoughts about using his gift on enemies contain no satisfaction or cruelty, just cold assessment of effectiveness. Edward found this detachment more disturbing than Jane's sadism, because it suggested something fundamental had broken in Alec, some capacity for emotional connection destroyed by early trauma and vampire transformation. Encountering nomadic vampires throughout his existence exposed Edward to the thoughts of vampires who lived without covens or philosophy, who simply existed and fed and moved on. Laurent's thoughts before his death revealed survival-focused consciousness, mind occupied primarily with assessing threats and opportunities. Laurent thought about the Denali Coven's vegetarian lifestyle as interesting experiment, but ultimately unsustainable. Believed he would eventually return to hunting humans because animal blood was too difficult to maintain long term. His thoughts contained no particular cruelty, but also no recognition that humans deserved moral consideration. They were food, and his hunting them was as natural and morally neutral as humans eating animals. Other nomadic vampires Edward had encountered over the years thought similarly, viewing humans as prey without guilt or philosophical conflict. They were not evil by their own understanding, simply being what they were, predators who had accepted their nature and lived accordingly. Edward heard their thoughts and recognized how easy it would be to think the same way, how much simpler existence would be if he stopped fighting his nature and simply accepted that humans were meant to be his food. The temptation appeared in their casual contentment, in the absence of the constant struggle that defined vegetarian vampire existence. But Edward also heard his own family's thoughts during hunts, heard the truth beneath their commitment to the vegetarian lifestyle. When they hunted animals, Edward heard the brief satisfaction animal blood provided, heard how it temporarily reduced the burning thirst without ever fully satisfying it the way human blood would. He heard Jasper's particular struggle, his thoughts dominated by thirst more intense than what other family members experienced, his constant battle to maintain control. He heard Emmett's occasional wistful thoughts about how much easier hunting humans would be. He heard even Carlyle experience moments of temptation when human blood scent reached him, heard his creator's discipline in pushing aside the desire and maintaining his values despite the cost. These thoughts reminded Edward that his family was not different in nature from vampires like James or Laurent or the Volturi, only different in choice. The predatory instinct existed in all of them. The thirst for human blood burned in every vampire throat regardless of philosophy. What separated the Cullens from other vampires was not absence of predatory nature, but constant choice to restrain it. Daily decision to value human life despite every instinct demanding they treat humans as prey. Edward heard this struggle in his family's thoughts and recognized his own struggle reflected there. Most disturbing were the moments when Edward heard predatory thoughts in himself, when his own consciousness broadcast the monster beneath his civilized exterior. When Bella's scent first reached him in biology class, Edward's immediate thought was how to kill her and everyone in the classroom to hide the evidence. The thought appeared automatically. Vampire instinct calculating the most efficient path to feeding. He suppressed it instantly, was horrified by it, but could not deny that his first reaction to Bella Swan was predatory calculation. He heard similar thoughts in himself during moments of weakness, when thirst burned intensely, or when human blood scent overwhelmed his control. The monster was not separate from him, but was his first impulse, his natural response, held back only through conscious effort. Edward used the thoughts he heard from other vampires as cautionary tales, as warnings about what he could become. James showed him the danger of embracing the hunt. Victoria showed him what grief could drive him to if he lost Bella. The Volturi showed him how power without morality created cruelty across millennia. The nomadic vampires showed him how easy it would be to stop struggling and simply accept predation as natural. His own thoughts showed him that the monster was always present, always waiting, always ready to emerge if he allowed his discipline to slip. Reading these minds, hearing these thoughts, Edward confronted the fundamental truth of his existence. He was not a good person who happened to be a vampire, but a vampire who chose daily to act against his nature, who would always be one moment of weakness away from becoming the predator he was designed to be. Edward's gift, for all its burdens and unending noise, has also been the force that has saved lives, his own, his family's and Bella's. In moments when instinct might have failed or time would have run out, his telepathy has made the difference between tragedy and survival. Across his long existence, there have been countless instances where the ability to hear thoughts has provided him with the one advantage even immortality could not otherwise grant. Foresight measured not in visions of the future like Alice's, but in the immediate pulse of other minds, the real-time awareness of intent. To Edward, these moments are proof that his curse is also a gift, that even the constant noise has meaning when it allows him to protect what he loves. The first, and perhaps most defining of these moments, came on a winter morning in Forks, when a van skidded across the icy school parking lot toward Bella Swan. Edward had been standing several cars away, distracted by casual human thoughts, when Tyler Crowley's mind erupted in panic. He heard the tires lose traction before the sound reached his physical hearing, heard Tyler's desperate thought, "I'm going to hit her," before Tyler himself understood what was happening. In that split second, Edward moved. He did not think, did not weigh consequences, only responded to the image in Tyler's mind of Bella's body crushed beneath metal. He crossed the distance faster than any human eye could track, intercepted the van, and stopped it with one hand pressed against the steel frame. To the humans watching, it was impossible. To Edward, it was inevitable. Every action was guided by the echo of thoughts he had heard before they became motion. Later, he would remember Tyler's mental replay of the accident, his disbelief, his terror, the insistence that Edward could not have moved that quickly. Edward listened to those thoughts in silence, maintaining the pretense of normalcy. His telepathy had exposed him to danger as much as it had protected Bella, because now the humans around him were thinking about his inhuman strength and speed. Yet even as he calculated how to contain suspicion, he could not regret the act. The thought of Bella dying when he had the power to prevent it would have been unbearable. Months later, in Port Angeles, his telepathy again became her salvation. Edward had been searching for her after hearing Jessica's thoughts that Bella had wandered off alone. As he drove through the streets, scanning the minds of every human nearby, he caught fragments that froze his still heart. 4 men were thinking about a girl walking down the street, one of them imagining what they would do to her, another calculating how to block her escape, another laughing silently at her fear. The images were sickening, clear and immediate. Edward followed those thoughts like a bloodhound following scent, locating the exact alley before his eyes could see it. By the time he reached her, the men had begun to close in. He heard their intentions unfolding in their minds, each vile and deliberate. And then, in an instant, those thoughts went silent. He arrived in the car, fury contained behind a calm voice, ordering Bella to get in. The men's minds filled with terror, the instinctive recognition of something predatory and powerful. He let them live only because killing them would have revealed what he truly was. But their thoughts, those dark, ugly shapes, haunted him for years, reminders of what human cruelty could be and what he was capable of destroying. His telepathy became an invisible shield long before Bella knew what he was. He used it to monitor her from a distance, ensuring she was safe even when he promised himself to stay away. He would sit in the cafeteria, listening not only to her friends' chatter, but to every mind in proximity, alert for any hint of danger. He became her unseen guardian, intercepting trouble before it could manifest. There were times when he caught stray thoughts of reckless drivers, inattentive teachers, or unstable strangers, and quietly altered events, moving Bella from harm's way without her ever knowing she'd been in danger. It was an invasion of privacy, but one he justified with the quiet desperation of love that could not bear the idea of loss. During the chaos of the hunt with James, Edward's telepathy again proved indispensable. When James first caught Bella's scent and decided she was his new prey, Edward heard the thought form before the words were spoken. It was not the scent alone that excited James, but the idea of challenge. Edward's protective stance over a human girl intrigued him. The moment James decided to hunt, Edward knew it. From that instant forward, every step of the pursuit was a battle of minds. Edward heard James strategizing, predicting their movements, planning routes to intercept them. He used those insights to keep Bella alive, changing direction moments before James could act. Each thought Edward intercepted bought them precious minutes. Each fragment of James's inner voice allowed him to counter moves before they happened. It was the closest thing Edward would ever experience to chess played with human lives at stake. And though the cost was high, the outcome proved the worth of his gift. Victoria's vengeance years later presented a more complex challenge. Her mind was often beyond his range, hidden by distance. But when she strayed close enough, Edward could sense the intensity of her thoughts. Grief sharpened to a blade within her. Her every calculation centered on punishing Edward by destroying what he loved most. Through fleeting glimpses of her mind, Edward learned of her newborn army before it fully formed, understanding her methods even before she executed them. He could not hear her constantly, but the fragments he did catch, images of training fields, of newborns tearing through forests, of plans whispered into minds weaker than hers, allowed the Cullens to prepare. Without those partial readings, they might have been destroyed. Among his family, Edward's telepathy often worked in harmony with Alice's visions, the two gifts weaving together to form something close to omniscience. Alice saw potential futures, shifting and uncertain. Edward read the present thoughts that determined which of those futures might occur. When Alice saw danger, Edward listened to the thoughts of those involved, determining whether the vision was imminent or avoidable. This combination had saved them countless times. During the confrontation with the newborn army in the clearing near Forks, Alice saw the battle before it happened, and Edward confirmed its trajectory by reading the thoughts of approaching enemies. Together, they coordinated defense with precision no human or vampire army could match. In moments of crisis, Alice's visions came to Edward fragmented, incomplete pictures of what might be. But when he linked them with the thoughts of those in the present, clarity formed. He could hear the choices being made, the decisions shaping the path of the future, and help Alice interpret which possibilities were fading and which were solidifying. It made them an unparalleled pair, balancing foresight with real-time awareness. During their confrontation with the Volturi in Volterra, Edward's telepathy became his greatest weapon and shield. Surrounded by ancient vampires whose power and authority dwarfed his, he relied on hearing their true intentions to navigate the perilous diplomacy. Aro's mind was a storm of fascination and greed. He admired Edward's restraint and despised it simultaneously. Edward heard his internal debate, his temptation to add Edward and Alice to his collection. When Aro smiled and spoke kindly, Edward knew it was performance. Beneath the gentle tone was calculation, whether killing the Cullens would serve his purpose better than recruiting them. Caius's thoughts were simpler, filled with suspicion and bloodlust. He wanted an excuse to destroy them, saw their unusual lifestyle as mockery of vampire nature. Edward's telepathy allowed him to predict when Caius would speak, to sense the moments when his impatience might turn deadly. Marcus's mind, quiet and empty, gave Edward the space to understand how ancient loneliness could hollow out even immortality. By reading them, Edward could guide his own words carefully, answering Aro's questions before they became accusations, appeasing Caius before violence erupted. In those tense hours beneath the marble halls of Volterra, Edward's telepathy likely saved all of them. When Aro decided, silently, that killing them would not serve his interest that day, Edward heard it before Aro spoke, before the relief reached anyone else. That moment, that internal whisper of reprieve, was the difference between destruction and survival. Over the decades, Edward's telepathy has also functioned as silent guardian against exposure. Living among humans requires constant vigilance, and his awareness of others' thoughts prevents small suspicions from turning into disasters. When curious neighbors wondered why the Cullens never aged, Edward knew instantly and helped craft explanations that satisfied curiosity before it deepened. He heard the thoughts of teachers who found Carlyle's eternal youth peculiar, the fleeting speculations of students who wondered about the family's strange beauty, the occasional mind that strayed too close to truth. Each time, he redirected attention through subtle action, steering conversations, adjusting behavior, ensuring suspicion evaporated before it could solidify. On hunting trips, his telepathy has prevented tragedy in quieter ways. He can hear the thoughts of nearby hikers or campers long before they are close enough to see the Cullens, allowing the family to change direction or hide before humans realize they are near predators. He has prevented countless accidental encounters this way, protecting both humans and family alike. The gift has not only saved lives in moments of danger, but also created profound emotional connections. When Bella became a vampire, when her transformation ended and she opened her eyes for the first time, Edward finally heard the voice that had been silent for so long. The first thought she projected was love, wordless, pure, radiant. It was not a sentence, but a feeling rendered into thought, and hearing it overwhelmed him. For nearly a century, he had endured her silence. Now her mind opened, filled with warmth and clarity that felt like music. The irony was exquisite. He had fallen in love with her because of her silence. And yet, hearing her mind for the first time deepened his understanding of that love. Through Bella's thoughts, Edward experienced what it meant for two minds to exist without barriers, equals in connection. He heard her marvel at her new senses, her astonishment at strength and clarity, her joy at finally sharing the one thing he had always wished to give her, his secret world of thoughts. Yet even as he listened, he missed the silence she had once given him. Her mind was beautiful, but her silence had been sanctuary. The duality of gift and loss mirrored the duality of his telepathy itself. Connection and solitude entwined, each impossible without the other. There were moments when hearing thoughts gave him something intangible, understanding. When Carlyle looked at him with quiet pride, Edward heard the unspoken emotions behind the expression, the fatherly affection, the relief that his first companion had become everything he hoped. When Esme smiled at him, he heard her thoughts of maternal love and the way she still saw him as the boy he once was. These thoughts, never spoken aloud, were gifts of their own, affirmations that he belonged to something greater than solitude. The most harrowing test of his telepathy came during the confrontation with the Volturi over Renesmee's existence. Surrounded by powerful vampires ready for war, Edward read hundreds of minds simultaneously. The Volturi Guard, the witnesses on both sides, the terrified but determined allies standing beside him. He heard fear and doubt urge, blending into a single psychic storm. Aro's thoughts were calculating as always, evaluating every possibility of gaining advantage. Caius's mind burned with eagerness for destruction. Marcus remained hollow, wishing for an end. But through that storm, Edward also heard something extraordinary, truth. As each witness testified, as thoughts of honesty radiated through the gathered minds, he knew that even the Volturi could not deny what was real. He heard Aro's doubt harden into resignation, Caius's anger fade into reluctant acceptance. When the decision came not to fight, Edward heard it in Ara's mind a heartbeat before it was spoken, felt relief spread through the consciousness of every ally. His gift turned what could have been a massacre into a standstill. Afterward, when the clearing was quiet again, Edward reflected on the strange grace of his existence. His telepathy had shown him every kind of thought, vile and pure, cruel and kind, selfish and selfless. He had seen the entire spectrum of consciousness, from monstrous predation to transcendent love. It had nearly broken him countless times, yet it had also given him understanding no one else possessed. He knew what people truly were beneath words, and that knowledge, painful as it often was, made compassion possible. He could not hate humanity when he knew how fragile and contradictory their thoughts were. He could not condemn vampires absolutely when he understood their struggle. His gift made judgment impossible, but empathy inevitable. Over time, Edward learned to see the noise not as chaos, but as chorus. Each mind around him added a note to the vast, intricate music of existence. The cruelty and the kindness, the fear and the hope, all intertwined into the ongoing song of consciousness. His ability to hear it was privilege as much as punishment. The world's thoughts were never silent, but they were also never meaningless. He often thinks of what his life would have been without telepathy. Perhaps quieter, perhaps easier. Yet he knows he would have lost something essential, the ability to understand others beyond words, the insight that has guided him toward mercy when anger might have prevailed. Without his gift, he might have become like James, guided by instinct alone. With it, he remains perpetually aware of the minds he protects, of the fragile complexity of every life he encounters. And in his quieter moments, when the world's thoughts hum around him like distant waves, Edward allows himself to appreciate the paradox. The gift that isolates him also connects him. The noise that drives him to solitude also saves the ones he loves. The burden that once made him despise existence has become the thread that binds his eternity together. For in every mind he reads, he finds reflection of his own struggle, the fight between nature and choice, instinct and morality. Each thought he hears reminds him that consciousness, whether human or vampire, is a constant act of balance. And though silence will never again belong to him, Edward Cullen has learned to live within the music of minds, finding harmony where once there was only endless, unrelenting sound. To live in the minds of others is to know the world too deeply, to feel every fear and secret that most hearts keep hidden. For Edward Cullen, silence has always been the unattainable dream, the one sound he cannot remember. His gift has shown him the beauty and the cruelty that coexist within thought, has burdened him with knowledge that no being should carry, yet has also granted him understanding that transcends words. Through endless centuries of consciousness, he has learned that every mind, however dark or luminous, echoes the same longing to be known and forgiven. In Bella's quiet mind, he finally found that peace, the stillness his immortal heart could not create for itself. When he listens to her now, when the world's chorus fades into a distant hum, he remembers what it means to rest. Perhaps true silence does not mean the absence of thought, but the presence of one mind that feels like home. And as night deepens around him, Edward lets the universe whisper, thoughts flickering like stars across the darkness, while he surrenders to the quiet he can never truly have, but will forever protect for those who can.